Hello, everyone, and welcome to another week of my podcast. Whereas this week, I'm going to be discussing the concept of the Champions League. For those of you who don't know what the Champions League is a tournament where that's played in football, worldwide football. So here in the US, it will be referred to as soccer, but it's a tournament where the biggest and the best clubs in Europe play against each other to determine the winner, and then the winner would be seen as the most powerful team and the most important team in the world at that moment. Several teams have won this competition, and some important them to know are Real Madrid, who have won this competition 15 times. There's also teams like AC Milan, who won it 7 times, Liverpool, who won it 6 times, Bayern Munich 6 times, Barcelona 5 times, and among a few others who've won the tournament a significant amount of times. The team I support, Manchester United, has won it 3 times, and so not every club that plays in these competitions has won it, but a select number of groups have won it several times, and those teams are the ones that are the most important teams in the world and the ones with the most global fan base, the ones who have the best players in the world playing for them, and that adds to the prestiginess of this tournament. Most sports fans, soccer fans, and people would agree that in terms of the sport soccer, this would be the second most important tournament in this sport, apart from the World Cup. Now, I have seen some debates and some people discussing that this tournament um, probably has a more difficult level than the World Cup, which I do understand because I feel sometimes for the World Cup, some of the teams that play there aren't exactly teams that are of a high level. Some of their players that play in those teams aren't playing at a high level. They might not be dedicated to the sport 100%, those low level teams. And whereas in the Champions League, I do feel every team that qualifies takes it more seriously than maybe some of the lower level teams at the World Cup. And basically, a high level of players play in this tournament, in which people then make their arguments that the Champions League is more difficult to win. And they sometimes refer to the fact of the knockout stages, how in recent years of the most recent Champions League in the knockout rounds, there have been more high level teams in terms of the clubs playing against each other than the last World Cup, where many people argue that the winners of that tournament, Argentina, didn't have to face that much strong opposition. They only faced two teams that were ranked in the top 10 in terms of the national teams, whereas for some of the Champions League winners, they have to face the current champions of their domestic tournaments, such as England or in Italy, and that further adds to the argument that this tournament is much more difficult to win than the World Cup. But I might have that opinion. I think it's very debatable. I do think the Champions League is slightly more difficult to win than per se the World Cup, but I would definitely say it's the second overall the most prestigious and the second best tournament in the world. I think nothing comes close to the World Cup, not just with soccer, I think just worldwide in terms of sports. I don't think there's anything above the World Cup in terms of the sporting world. But there are a lot of things that happen that make the Champions League special and have that specialty that maybe even sometimes the World Cup has. For example, comebacks. The good thing about the Champions League is that games are played in a series of two matches, especially in the knockout rounds, where essentially teams have to play a game at their home stadium and then they travel to their opponent's stadium, and essentially the opponent who scores the most amount of goals goes through to the next round. Whereas in the World Cup, every match is played on the basis of just one match, and the winner is determined at that single match. And if there's a tie, we have tiebreakers like penalty shootouts, and then the winner comes out from there. But having to play two matches for against your opponent, I would say adds a little more excitement to the series that and the two opponents are playing against each other. Now, in terms of those specific comebacks, the first tournament that I watched and was invested in the Champions Leagues was during the 2018 and 2019 calendar year. And that, in my opinion, I would say has been the best tournament that I've seen so far. And I've seen, I think it was about 7 tournaments. And I think what was the highlight were the comebacks. There was so much amount of comebacks that happened in the tournament that I don't think I've ever seen in any other future Champions League as much as there were in this one. For example, in the first stage of the knockout rounds, the round of 16, obviously 16 teams competing against each other, there was a total of four comebacks out of the eight matches that were played in that round. The first comeback that happened was between the Italian supergiants Juventus, led by Cristiano Ronaldo, one of the best players of all time, against Atletico de Madrid, the third best team in Spain. The first match was played at Atletico Madrid Stadium, where they won 2-0. Now, 2-0 is not exactly uh, a dominant win, but it puts like a strong statement on the tie. And many people have made the argument that when a team wins 2-0, it's a little misleading because that has been the result that's been made various comebacks among the years. And many people were saying that, oh, Atletico were going through. There was no way that they could make a comeback. Juventus couldn't make a comeback. But then in the second leg in Juventus's home stadium, led by Cristiano Ronaldo, he scored a hat trick, which means that he scored three goals, and they led the tie 3-2, and therefore marked the first comeback of that tournament. That was going to mark a bunch of comebacks for what was about to happen in that tournament. And I think it's interesting to note that Cristiano Ronaldo, the opponent that he has scored most goals among, has been Atletico de Madrid. He scored a bunch of hat tricks when he used to play for Real Madrid. And since Real Madrid are the rivals of Atletico de Madrid, they would face off against each other a lot domestically in Spain. And Ronaldo did what he had to do, what he normally does, scores against Atletico. He scored three, and boom, just like that, the first comeback was made. Now, the next comeback that happened in this round was between Real Madrid versus Ajax. Now, heading into this tournament, Real Madrid were three-time back-to-back champions of this tournament. Many people said that was one of the best teams we've seen of all time, one of the most dominant teams we have of all time. But Cristiano Ronaldo had left prior to the seasons began. I mean, people, and they essentially lost a pillar and a strong point of their team. And throughout the entirety of that season, Real Madrid fell off drastically. They weren't the same Real Madrid that won their three titles in those previous campaigns. But everyone was essentially backing them to beat Ajax because Ajax is more of a small scale team. They usually don't go far in this tournament. And Real Madrid, even though despite them being going through a difficult time, everyone was backing them to win. Even myself, I thought Real Madrid would get a job done. But then the first match was played at Ajax's stadium, and as expected, Real Madrid won 2-1. So then the second match was going to be played at the Santiago Bernabeu, which is Real Madrid's stadium. And to everyone's surprise, Ajax won that game 4-1, which meant that they were up in the series 5-3. And they made a huge upset by eliminating the defending champions when no one was really expecting them to do that. And it was also, not only was it a story of a good comeback, but it was an underdog story, which was praised by many, including myself. And I probably think that's one of the most important comebacks of that tournament. The next comeback that happened, which was my own personal favorite, the reason being because it had to do with the team that I support, Manchester United. They went up against French giants PSG. In the first leg was played at Old Trafford, which is the home stadium for Man United. PSG won 2-0, and they were pretty much had a foothold on advancing because they had already won away. So the hard part was essentially done. They had to play at home, which was everyone was expecting for them to win, especially considering the fact that Manchester United had a bunch of injuries heading into that match. Many of their key players were out, so no one really thought United could do something. But then the match began, and United's basically their substitute players did what they had to do, and they shocked everyone and won 3-1. Now, here's an important thing to note. Since PSG won 2-0 in the first match and Manchester United won 3-1 in the second match. That means the total aggregate score was 3-3. However, the tiebreaker here was that the visiting team that scored the most goals went through. And since PSG scored 2 goals in their away match, and Manchester United scored 3 goals in their away match, Man United went through because they scored the most goals away. And that was a tiebreaker that existed back then. That rule was then changed in the 2021-2022 season, where that rule didn't apply anymore. But in that instance, it did, and so United did what they had to do. They made the comeback, and boom, third comeback of that round. Another comeback that happened, but was more smaller and wasn't talked about because the teams weren't that much of protagonists, were Portuguese team Porto against Italian team Roma. Um, Roma won their match at home 2-1, but then Porto came back in the second match and won 3-1 and won 4-3 on the tie, and they made a comeback too, and they went through to the next round. And now we get to the next round, the quarterfinals. There were 8 teams now competing against each other, and a comeback also happened here. Well, a comeback happened, but then there was also a really interesting match that many dubbed as one of the best matches of all time in the history of the Champions League. And that I'm talking about the Manchester City against Tottenham Hotspur match. That being because Spurs, the Tottenham Hotspur team, they won their match 1-0 at home, but then the second match was that one referred to as one of the best matches of all time because the first 20 minutes were some of the most exciting we've seen in the sport because Man City scored first, which meant they were all tied, but then Tottenham scored a second and a third goal, meaning they were up 3-1 on aggregate. But a few minutes later, Manchester City scored 2 other goals, and it was only 20 minutes, and now we were 3-3 on aggregate. But because Tottenham scored away from home, they were up on the tie. And then in the second half, Manchester City scored their 4th goal, where it was the first time they were up in that series. But then Tottenham scored a 4th goal, which meant they were going through. And then there was a last-minute drama where Manchester City had scored the winner of the game and the tie, but that goal was ruled offside, which meant Tottenham went through. And even though technically there wasn't a comeback, it was a match that made that season of the Champions League even more special. The actual comeback that did go through was in the match with the 2 teams that I already discussed that did a comeback themselves, underdogs Ajax and a Juventus led by Cristiano Ronaldo. In this match, the first match was played at Ajax's stadium, and that match ended as a draw. But considering it was the away goals rule, Juventus was up because they had scored away from home, meaning they were the favorites to go through, and especially because it was at home, they had Cristiano Ronaldo being in good form. Everyone was assuming they would go through. And it seemed that it was going that way because Juventus was 2-1 up on aggregate, 1-0 up on the match. But then Ajax scored, meaning everything was leveled down to the match, down to the aggregate score. And then they find the winner. Therefore, they were up 3-2 on the tie, 2-1 on the night. And boom, another comeback came through. A major upset considering that Cristiano Ronaldo's Juve were one of the favorites to win that match or the tournament, but they were out just like that. And in terms of the comebacks, we wouldn't see 2 more until the semifinals. And oh my goodness, in the semifinal rounds were the 2 best comebacks that, in my opinion, we've seen in the history of this competition, and the 2 best comebacks of that certain edition. The teams that were facing off were English giants Liverpool against Spanish giants Barcelona, and the other match consisted of Tottenham Hotspur and Ajax, who we've already discussed about so far in this show. Now, the first comeback that happened, Barcelona won 3-0 in the first match at home. Now, a 3-0 score is very, very difficult to do a comeback against and go through being that many goals down. So this was a case where literally almost no one thought that Liverpool were going to go through, especially given that their 2 main players Roberto Firmino and Mohamed Salah were out. They were out injured. They weren't going to be able to play that match. And Barcelona were on really, really, really good form. They were really, really strong, consistent, and the number one favorite to win that match. Another reason for this being the case was because they had the world's best player, Lionel Messi, playing for them. And he was on such a good form during that year. Many would argue that was one of his better seasons of all time. And so everyone was expecting Barca to go through. But to everyone's surprise, Liverpool at home were so strong. The atmosphere was so intense for Barcelona, the visiting team, that motivated the Liverpool's players to get a first goal in the first half. And then in the second half, the second and the third goal came in very quick succession. They were all already tied. And then in the 70th minute in the match, the fourth goal came. They did the comeback. No one thought it was possible, but here we are. It happened. Liverpool Liverpool substitute players scored 4 goals and knocked the favorite to win the Champions League out, and which was really epic to see. The next semi-final match though was just as epic, that being because the first match was played at Tottenham Stadium. Ajax won 1-0, and then in the second half, or my bad, the second match at Ajax Stadium, Ajax literally went up 2 goals, which means there were now a total of 3 goals up, which meant if Tottenham were to go through, they would have to score at least 3 so that they could be tied on aggregate. But considering that Ajax had only scored 1 goal away from home, and theoretically Tottenham would score 3 goals, that means they would go through. So they needed to do something really fast because there was only like 40 minutes left of that match, and they needed to score 3 goals, which seems like a very difficult task. And then in the 50th minute, or in the 50th minute mark, Spurs got 2 goals, which meant they only needed one. And literally in the last moment, in the last minute of the match, they did. They scored their 3rd goal, caused the upset, and boom. Just like the previous semifinal series, we had another comeback that happened. And that pretty much concluded the story of the comebacks of this tournament. And the final was between Liverpool and Tottenham. And Liverpool won that final 2-0, which was rather underwhelming. It was not really an interesting match. It was a little boring. Not too much happened, which really, I would say, kind of ruined the whole vibe of the whole comeback story. But it's okay. We still had a bunch of great matches and great series that all of us sports fans and soccer fans enjoyed to the fullest, and which for me it enforces the point that the 2018 to 2019 season has been the best one that I've seen because of all the comebacks that happened in that tournament and that edition. Now, I feel that another great point that makes this tournament so special is the underdog stories that we get to see. There's been a couple of editions where we've seen underdog teams go really, really far and go like to the final stages, like to the semifinals. In the my previous point where I talked about the season of the comebacks, Ajax was one of those teams. They made it all the way to the semifinals, but they ultimately had a comeback done against them by Tottenham Hotspur when everyone was assuming that they were going to be one of those teams that reached to the final because of the good football that they were playing, despite them being an underdog, which was one of those underdog stories. Apart from that, the next season, the 2020 season, which was the season of the pandemic, which was interesting because in that edition, there was no two-legged matches that happened. All matches were played on the basis of one match in a neutral venue, which all the matches were played in Portugal to protect the players and any traveling members and staff from risk of getting COVID-19. And so this meant that many teams weren't going to have that that extra element of playing at their home stadium, since all the matches were playing at neutral venues. But this led to two underdogs getting really far. These were the French teams Lyon and German team RB Leipzig. Now, in the case of RB Leipzig, it's very interesting because that was their first edition that they ever played, and they got all the way to the semifinals. Their path essentially started. They topped their group. They didn't really have that much of a difficult group for them, so it wasn't that hard for them to get out of that group. And in the round of 16, they faced against Tottenham Hotspur, which were the finalists of the previous edition. And they had a dominant display against them by winning 4-0 on aggregate. And now they went to the quarterfinals. And in that part of the tournament, it was already the point where they were playing in neutral venues. And basically, COVID had already taken its effect on this tournament by then. No fans at the stadiums. And they faced off against Atletico de Madrid, who were the favorites to advance in that match, and one of the favorites to win the tournament. But RB Leipzig were the far better team in that match. They eliminated them 2-1, and then they headed towards the semifinal against PSG, which was the number one second favorite to win that match. But their underdog story had ended there. PSG were really dominant against them. They destroyed them 3-0. RB Leipzig had no response whatsoever, but a great underdog story had ended there. Now, in the case of the French team, Lyon, they were actually in the same group as RB Leipzig too. They were the two teams in that group that made it out. So it was basically, I guess you could say, the underdog group. And their path began in the round of 16 against Cristiano Ronaldo's Juventus, and to everyone's surprise, they eliminated them. Then they went off against to the quarterfinals in the neutral venue against Manchester City, which was one of the favorites as well. They beat them. They were the better team. They took all their chances and won 3-1 and eliminated them. Then in the semifinal, they faced the number one team, one of the best teams of the world, and probably one of the best teams I've seen play in terms of how good they were, how dominant they were. Their winning record they had was Bayern Munich. And just as expected, they did their job. They beat Lyon 3-0 and they advanced to the final, which meant the underdog stories had ended at that semifinal phase. Now, we wouldn't see another underdog story until the 2021-2022 season with Spanish teams Villarreal. Now, the story of this team is very interesting because the Spanish city of Villarreal has literally a low amount of population. So the fact that their team got really far in this tournament, they got all the way to the semifinals, was such of high importance to them and was really valued in their city, which again, one of the pillars and main points of what the sport can do with the significance that either a national team or a club can have to either a country or a city is very remarkable, especially with considering what Villarreal did to the people of that city. So their campaign in the knockout stages, they went up against Cristiano Ronaldo Juventus, and they were the underdogs. And just like I've already discussed with the bunch of underdogs in the comebacks, they eliminated one of the better team that was chosen to advance. Then in the quarterfinals, they went up against Bayern Munich, again another protagonist team, one of the favorites to usually win it. Villarreal won in their own stadium 1-0 to everyone's surprise. But in the second match, everyone was expecting Bayern Munich to come back, given that they were playing at Bayern Munich's stadium, and Bayern Munich is really strong in that stadium. But Villarreal was able to salvage a draw, which meant they went through 2-1 on aggregate, therefore qualifying to the semifinals where they faced off against English giants Liverpool. But their story had ended there, as in the first match, they lost 2-0 at Liverpool Stadium, which meant they had to do something special at their own stadium with their own people. And in that stadium, it seemed a comeback was going to happen because they went 2-0 up during the first half, which basically meant they were already tied and they only needed one more goal to advance. But then Liverpool took care of business. They scored 3 goals. So they were up 5-2 on aggregate and they were eliminated, and Villarreal's underdog story ended there. So basically, in all the amount of years I have of watching the Champions League, the underdogs have gone far. The highest they've gone has been the underdogs, and no underdog has sadly yet won the tournament. And I think many football fans would want to see that. I think an underdog team winning it is something, for the most part, most people would want to see. A bunch of sports fans would like that because of what the significance that an underdog team winning a tournament of that high level can basically means. And so hopefully in some of the more future editions that are about to come, we get to see that story happen again. That has happened in previous years of underdogs winning, but it's been so long since that's happened, but hopefully it could come back one day. I interrupt this show to bring you a fun interactive trivia. In this portion, I will ask 3 different questions relating to the topic of the show, and whoever comments the correct answers first will get a like, a comment, and a subscription back to their channel. First question: which teams have won the tournament back to back? Next question: what year was the tournament rebranded to the UEFA Champions League? Final question: who was or were the goal scorers of the 2020 Champions League final? So once again, the first comment that gets all of the 3 answers correct will get a like, a comment back, and a subscription back to their channel. Thank you for participating in this trivia questions, and we'll get right back to the show. But something else I really wanted to focus on was a singular campaign of a certain team, and one of the additions that honestly to me was so impressive and was so fascinating to see, and that was Real Madrid's campaign in the 2021-2022 season. That being because, so essentially I already touched point on this a little bit, because in the 2018-2019 edition, Real Madrid were 3-time champions, having won the tournament back-to-back for 3 editions. But then because Cristiano Ronaldo left the team became basically, they became bad because they lost one of their strong pillars, and they hadn't won that edition up to that point, up to the 2021-2022 season. They really struggled to find momentum and important wins in this tournament in those certain editions. And they weren't like one of the favorites to win that tournament. Not many people were counting on them to do anything special. And so, but they did get to the knockout stages. They were usually that was like the bare minimum that they would do during those years, is get to the knockout stages. And so they did, as they were expected to do. They got to the knockout rounds, but they were going to face up in the round of 16 against French giants PSG. Now, what made this interesting was Lionel Messi had barely made that move to PSG, and many people were expecting that Lionel Messi was going to get the job done against Real Madrid. They were the favorites heading into that match. And in that first game that they played was at PSG Stadium, and PSG were so dominant. But the scoreline was 1-0. That they only won with 1 goal, which didn't really reflect the match that was being played, because PSG was so dominant. They got chance after chance after chance after chance, but they just couldn't score. Their goalkeeper, Real Madrid's goalkeeper Thibaut Courtois, was literally the man of the match for Real Madrid, as his saves were very crucial in them not getting battered or getting destroyed by a huge amount of goals. And it was that goal that was scored literally came at the last moment and the last minute of the match. So unfortunately for Real Madrid, they didn't get the draw, as would have been really beneficial to them. But they only lost 1-0, so it wasn't too bad. And so then came the second leg, the second match at Real Madrid Stadium, where losing 1-0 isn't necessarily the worst of things. It's really not that much hard to do a comeback against. And so the match began, but PSG went up 2-0. They scored the goal in that match and were 2-0 up in aggregate, meaning Real Madrid would have to score 3 goals if they wanted any chance to go through. And it happened. One of their players, Karim Benzema, that was like the season of his life, his prime season, where he would score basically in every match. He was very crucial in this campaign. He scored 3 goals, meaning he scored a hat trick, which is very valuable because that basically eliminated PSG, and Real Madrid had done something that they hadn't done in a long time, which was produce a game of that caliber, a match of that caliber, like an importance, a win that proved the statement that they still had it, that they still could do something in this tournament because they weren't doing it up to that point in the previous editions beforehand. But they did, and now they moved on to the quarterfinals where they were matched against the current title holders at the time, which was English club Chelsea. Now, out of all the matches that Real Madrid had to play in the knockout rounds, this was the most even match. Many people were saying that Chelsea would go through. Others were saying Real Madrid had it. And I think for myself, I think it was the hardest match I had to predict. I really wasn't sure who to pick, but I slightly edged Chelsea as I did see them as the slightly better team heading into that match. And so the first leg was played at Chelsea Stadium, and Real Madrid won 3-1. Chelsea made a lot of errors that ended up costing them in the long run. And so Madrid did what they had to do. They won 3-1 on the night. So heading into the second match in their own stadium in the Bernabeu, Real Madrid's home, people were expecting Real Madrid to just win that match comfortably, that Chelsea weren't going to pose that much of a threat. But to everyone's surprise, Chelsea came on form. They were dominant. They had that will to want to go through and to make a comeback. And sooner or later, Chelsea were up 3-0 on the night, which meant they were going through at the moment because on aggregate they were up 4-3. However, in the 80th minute, one of Real Madrid's youngsters, Brazilian player Rodrigo, scored the match that tied the series, which meant they would have to go to extra time to find a winner. And again, Karim Benzema, the player of the moment at that time, scored the winner, the one that sent Real Madrid through to the semifinals. And that was honestly a great comeback to see, because essentially a double comeback happened, because Chelsea came back first. They were up 4-3 on aggregate, but then Real Madrid scored 2 goals, and now they were up 5-3. It was one of like the better teams or better matches that we got to see in this season. And Real Madrid did it again. They made another magical comeback in that tournament, and that got them to the semifinals, which in my opinion was the best comeback that this tournament had to offer, one of the best comebacks of all time. That being because Manchester City have been one of the most powerful teams that has been like around the last 5 years of the sport. They were the favorites heading into the series, and everyone was expecting them to dominate Madrid like easily. Madrid wasn't even given that much of a chance. And then the first match at the Etihad Stadium, Manchester City's home, it was honestly, Man City were so dominant. They were so powerful. They managed to score 4 goals. The thing was, though, Madrid got really lucky in this match because Manchester City had like the opportunities and the chances to create a way more larger amount of goals, but they didn't capitalize on their chances. And they only managed to score 4, which, I mean, it's still a lot of goals, but the scoreline was flattering for them. However, though, Madrid got lucky and they got chances of their own, and they got to score 3 goals. So it wasn't necessarily the worst thing ever, since they were only lost 4-3, meaning by difference they were only 1 goal down. And they were really lucky to score their 3 goals that they did. But now we're heading on to the second match. And this match was where the comeback happened, because it was essentially kind of a carbon copy of the first match prior to Real Madrid scoring, because Manchester City were the dominant team. The goalkeeper, Real Madrid's goalkeeper, was saving them from all the chances that Manchester City were creating. And Man City, they just were looking like the team that they were going to go through, especially given that they had already scored their first goal. But then the 90th minute, literally the final minute of that match, by that point, Real Madrid, they were down 5-3. If they were going to make a comeback, they had to score 2 goals. And given that we were in the 90th minute, the match was about to end. Literally, fans were leaving the stadium. Everyone was like, okay, yeah, Man City are going through. But out of nowhere, boom, Real Madrid get their first goal. And it was the Brazilian youngster Rodrigo who scored that first goal. That gave Real Madrid hope, but still, no one had that much faith. They're like, it's probably just a consolate goal. It isn't going to inspire that much. But to everyone's surprise, I kid you not, 1 minute later, boom, Real Madrid get their second goal of the night. and they were up in that match 2-1, but that means they were now tied 5-5. And the whole stadium erupted, celebrations were taking place. No one could believe it. Like, they did it again. The most It's the season of comebacks for Real Madrid. Every time they're down, they found some way to just come back to either tie or eliminate their rivals, who in all three series and all three ties, they were the team that didn't play the best football. Their teams were the ones who were the favorite. Their opponents were the favorites. Their rivals played better. They deserve to go through. But in this sport, that doesn't matter. Being the better team or being the team that plays better, it doesn't matter. You have to be the team that scores the most amount of goals to win. And that's what they showed in the quarterfinals and the round of 16 and the semifinals. And in this specific match, since they were already tied 5-5, the 30 minutes of extra time were played, and Real Madrid were giving a penalty, which the star player, the best player of the team, Karim Benzema, scored. They were already 3-1 up, which means they were going through 6-5 in aggregate, and just like that, they eliminated Manchester City and were headed to the final. Now, in this final, a comeback didn't happen, but it was another memorable performance by Real Madrid. But not because of what we saw on the pitch. It was because their rivals, English giants Liverpool, the team that had eliminated Villarreal, the underdog of that season, they were the dominant team. They had so many chances to score, but they just couldn't capitalize them. They were the better team. The goalkeeper was honestly one of the star players of the entire tournament for Real Madrid, especially in that match. He made a total of, I don't exactly remember the number, but like a total of like 10 or more saves that were really crucial for Real Madrid to win, because Liverpool had chance after chance after chance, but Courtois kept denying them. Didn't let them score, didn't let them do anything, and boom, the one chance that Real Madrid did had, they capitalized on that and won 1-0. I think in that match they only had 2 shots on target, and they were able to score one of those chances they had, and they won 1-0, and boom, they finally became the team that they were at one point. The strong and dominant team that everyone feared, that no team wanted to play against, the kings of the competition, that shows that if you're going to beat them, it's going to take a lot to really beat them, considering that they found a way to go up against the most difficult of circumstances because of all the comebacks they were to produce, the favorite teams they had to eliminate, teams, opponents that were so much better than them, that played so much better than them, that deserved to go to win or to eliminate them. They just didn't, because Real Madrid found a way. And I think that's what their 2022 campaign, that specific campaign, was the best campaign I've seen from a certain team they were able to do. It was full of mystic and I guess you could say aura as well. That Real Madrid team had a bunch of that, and boom, they were the kings of Europe were back. But enough dwelling on past competitions and everything. The focus now is on this season, this tournament, the 2024-2025 season. And before this tournament began, there was a series of controversies that took place, especially being because the original group stage format was going to be changed. Because, as I mentioned in the beginning of the show, the group stages consisted of teams being going up against 3 opponents, where they would play a series of home and away matches, and the teams that made the most amount of points, they were the 2 teams that got the most amount of points would go through to the knockout stages. This format was changed. The original format was scrapped, and now this new format consisted of, and in this new edition, the format was going to be played where teams weren't going to play home and away matches against a specific team. They were still going to play matches at their stadium, matches away, but they were only going to play against their opponents once. And the number increased from 6 matches being played to 8 matches being played. Now that in itself brought a lot of controversy too, because many players themselves and managers were upset that players were going to have to play more amount of matches, and there was going to be a tough and a demanding schedule schedule for them to play more games, and many players felt that that was going to take a toll on their bodies. They were going to have a risk of getting more injuries, and many people weren't too happy about that. Fans themselves also were included that, the organizers UEFA wouldn't putting the players risk, first because of the more amount of matches that were being played and the tight schedules that it could lead to serious and long-term injuries for the players. So that was the first controversy. The second controversy was because the format was changed into a league phase where the teams that would go through would be the teams with the most amount of points, but not in a group format, rather in a league format, which every team was going to be in basically one group, but they want to play against every team in that group. They want to play against teams they were drawn against. And then the top, I think it was 8 teams that had the most amount of points would go to the knockout rounds, and the teams from 9 to 24 would play a playoff series of matches they they would be deciding. They would play against each other to decide who was going to go through, which team was going to go through to the knockout rounds to complete the entirety of the 16 teams that took place in the first stage of the knockout rounds. And also, the whole format was a little confusing at first. I myself struggled a little bit to understand it, so apologies if it seemed too confusing in my explanation. But many people are also arguing or complaining that this new edition was too difficult to understand. The previous edition, they were literally easy to understand. The format was quite simple. They saw the format as perfect. Like, why change something that is already perfect if people already view it like that? However, I do think the final match day was the most interesting bit of the group stages because many high level teams that were underperforming were basically playing their elimination and their survival in this tournament, because one moment they were still in those positions of going through to the next stages, and other moments they were getting eliminated. So their result on that final day was really crucial, and so every soccer fan was attend to those matches on the final day, and that was probably one of the best moments of that group stage. And so the first round of the knockout stages did go through. We got our teams that were going through and our teams that got eliminated. Manchester City, unfortunately for them, they've been underperforming this season, so they got eliminated. The Giants, Real Madrid, they were also took part of this round. They went through. Other giants like Bayern Munich and Borussia Dortmund, they were able to go through and earn their ticket to the round of 16, which brings us up to date to the round of the 16 matches. And we had a bunch of interesting matches taking place. The first match being PSG against Liverpool. Now, for me personally, the favorite in this match is Liverpool because they've been really dominant this season. They're at the top of their league. They're playing really great football right now. They're dominant too. But something that's been noted is that they've been falling off. A bunch of their more recent games, they've been getting draws here and there. And many people think that it's a point of the season where their players are worn out, maybe even tired and exhausted, and there's going to be a decline in their good momentum that they have right now, while PSG is the opposite. They started off pretty bad. They also qualified for the playoff stages of the knockout rounds, but they're getting quite dominant in their league, and in this Champions League too, they're getting quite dominant. And for my pick, even though Liverpool is the favorite, I do favor PSG a bit, and I do think they will go through. So for the first match of the round of 16, I predict PSG to go through. Now, the next match is against Real Madrid against Atletico Madrid, which in my opinion is going to be the best game to watch and to look forward to, because it's the city rivals of the city of Madrid, between Atletico Madrid and Real Madrid. And I favor Real Madrid to win because despite them having an underperforming season, I do think they're starting to click now and they're getting better. And in the Champions League, they have played before a select number of times, and every time they've played against each other, Real Madrid has always come out on top and has always eliminated Atletico. Atletico has never ever eliminated Real Madrid in the Champions League. However, there is a first time for everything. So even though Atletico are the better team on paper and are the team in form, I still think Real Madrid are going to go through. Some of the other matchups taking place, PSV against Arsenal. I think this one's going to be a no-brainer. I think Arsenal are going to win. They're the far better team against Dutch team PSV, while Arsenal are competing for top spot in the Premier League against Liverpool in England, and they have a far better squad, far better players. And so to me, I think this is one of those rounds that are like a no-brainer. I really don't see PSV doing anything dangerous to Arsenal, and I do think Arsenal got everything to go through. So that's my pick for that match. The next matchup is Belgian team Club Brugge against English team Aston Villa. This isn't really much a series of protagonists that this matchup, because these teams aren't really ones that regularly take place in this competition. They don't go far, they don't do anything special, but I would say my pick for this one would be Aston Villa, considering they're one of the top teams right now in English football, while the Belgian team isn't too strong. Club Brugge isn't too strong. I My pick is Aston Villa to go through in that match. Now for the next matchup, to me, in my opinion, I think is similar to the PSV Arsenal prediction. Between Benfica and Barcelona, Portuguese team Benfica and Spanish Giants Barcelona. I think Barcelona are going to go through. They're probably the number one favorites to win the tournament, and probably the best team in the world right now. They've been having amazing performance after amazing performance, dominance after dominance. They've been doing really, really, really good. And I don't see how Benfica, considering the skill gap that there is between Barcelona and Benfica, I don't see how Benfica could do damage to them. These teams also played in the group stages where Barcelona, it was a really great match, but Barcelona ended up winning 5-4 to everyone's surprise. And I just don't see how Benfica can go through, and I got Barca going through in that match. Another no-brainer match or no-brainer pick is between Italian club Inter Milan and Dutch team Feyenoord. I think Inter Milan will go through. They're competing for top spot in the Italian league, and they're so much better, have way better players, and are more consistent than the Dutch team. And my pick is Inter Milan. I think they'll take care of business without really much struggling against their opponents. Now, in my opinion, the first of the two matchups that are really difficult for me to predict involve Bundesliga teams, which means German teams. The first matchup is an all-German matchup. Bayern Munich and Bayer Leverkusen, two German teams. The two teams that are competing right now for the German title. And the reason why it's difficult for me to pick a winner in this match is because Bayern Munich have the European pedigree. They do well in this competition. They get far. They're the third most winners of this competition, but they aren't having a good season right now. They've been having underwhelming performances here and there, while Bayer Leverkusen are an underdog team. They won the league last season when no one was expecting them to do so, but they have really great players right now. Their manager is also world class. They're doing really, really great. And in the last couple years, Bayern Munich hasn't been able to get a positive result against Leverkusen. They've gone in draw after draw and lost. They haven't won against them, I think, since 2022, if I'm not mistaken. And so that's why I can see it difficult for Bayern Munich to win this tie against Leverkusen. But then again, Leverkusen aren't a team that usually compete or get this far in the tournament. They usually go out in the group stages and don't get far in the knockout rounds. But then again, Bayern Munich haven't done that well up against Bayer Leverkusen, and Bayer Leverkusen is doing really well right now. And so it's a difficult one for me to pick, but if I had to pick, do this. I'll give a slight edge to Leverkusen. I do think they got what it takes to eliminate Bayern. It's gonna be a really, really close. Both matches are gonna be really close to each other, but I think Leverkusen will squeeze through and eliminate the Giants, Bayern Munich. Now, the other matchup that I can't quite call is German team Borussia Dortmund and French team Lille. That being because Dortmund have been so awful this season. They haven't been good, remotely good, but they have gotten this far the tournament. So, in some aspect, they're doing this in international competitions well. Whereas Lille isn't really that much of a strong team, not much of a protagonist. It's essentially this matchup is against two not very good teams going up against each other, and it's just who is the worst out of these two teams that are already not good. And so I something tells me maybe Borussia Dortmund will have a slight edge considering they won their playoff match against a Portuguese team, Sporting CP. But then again, I feel the French team, considering that they finished among the first eight in the table and automatically qualified for the round of 16, I feel they might have that extra edge in them, and they probably will have what it takes to eliminate Dortmund, which is why I think this will be a really close matchup, just like the previous one I discussed. I think whoever ends up advancing will be by something minimal. I wouldn't be surprised if a match like this went to penalties for the tiebreaker, but I will edge it and give it to the French team, Lille, and I think they will get the job done and eliminate Dortmund. And those are essentially my picks for this edition of the round of 16. In a couple weeks, I might have a show revisiting my predictions and doing an analysis of the previous matches that took place. And yeah, that was the podcast for this week. Thank you for listening to my intake for this edition of the Champions League and my predictions and an overview and of previous editions of the Champions League and why this tournament has such importance and value to it because of what it could produce, like in terms of the comebacks, the campaign of certain teams, because of the mystic that can produce, and even the underdog stories. So the overview of the Champions Leagues, thank you for listening for that. And we hope you can tune in a couple weeks to listen to a show about me reviewing the predictions of the round of 16, given that the matches have already taken place. So thank you all for listening, and we hope you can tune in to the next show. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day.